It's now my pleasure to introduce Kirk Samson of Samson Atlantic. He's been a member of the association now for 3 years, even while he was finishing his 20 years residence in Europe, where he traveled all over as a diplomat and an advisor. Kirk literally just moved to the United States, to Highland Park, like 2 weeks ago. So we're talking a fresh, informed perspective on what's going on in Europe and how the tariffs are affecting it. So please welcome Kirk Samson.
Thank you, Richard. It's always a pleasure to meet with this august body. I've had an opportunity to meet some of you before, and then again some of you today, and I know that there's an awful lot of knowledge in this room about trade issues. So I'd like to make sure that this is a dialogue, and I welcome anyone who's got some thoughts as we go through my slides to please put up your hand, and I'd be more than happy to acknowledge you so that you can share your insight and experience with the crowd here. My business exists to help U.S. companies intelligently move their business operations into Europe. That's what I do. I do market research, I do site selection assistance, and the reason why I can do that is because of the people that I know in Europe and the 20 years that I've spent there. I lived in 7 different European countries. I speak those languages, some of them decently, and the fact of the matter is it's a fascinatingly diverse continent. And so for me to say the view from Europe, you'll have to forgive me because I'm simplifying things a bit. I'm trying to give you the view from 4 different locations in Europe. The primary one that most of us are probably prepared to talk about today would be the European Union, but there are other players that we need to discuss, I think, to get the whole perspective on this ongoing trade conflict, which is not just between the United States and China, obviously, but the United States and the EU was threatened, the United States and Turkey, and the United States and Russia. So with that, this is a brief roadmap of what I'd like to go over in the next 40 minutes. And I think the first thing to jump into is, like I said, a lot of expertise in the room, but still I'd like to just gloss over the basics a bit so that we are on the same page when it comes to discussion of what's relevant for Europe and for this discussion. I want to talk about how the term trade war is not a misnomer. And this is something near and dear to my heart as someone who worked for the Department of Defense for 2 decades. I want to discuss the view from Europe, and then I'm going to hopefully highlight some good strategies how many of the companies in this area can also hedge their trade risks moving forward. This is a great slide that is maybe a little hard for you to see. It's a dynamic slide that shows you the different definitions of Europe. The 28 states of the European Union, the 27 states after Brexit. It talks about who's in Schengen, who's in the Eurozone. I stole this off of somebody else's webpage, so if any of you are interested in using it, I'll be more than happy to pass it on to you. But I acknowledge it's a great product because it's a very confusing geographic location. And what is listed on there, as I mentioned, is the EU, but there's also something called the EFTA, or the EEA, which is Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, thank you. Ukraine and Turkey are also relevant as to the EU because they both have special access agreements. And then finally, we need to talk about the Russian Federation because the Russian Federation's major trading partner is Europe as a whole. And yet, that is a very tense relationship for the reasons we'll get into later. This, again, I'll do it quickly. Tariffs impact companies, as you know, by raising costs. That is the first one. I was talking with the people installing the very expensive new air conditioning system into my house yesterday about how their costs have gone up considerably based upon aluminum costs. That is an immediate impact of a tariff. Secondarily, products become less competitive as tariffs continue. If you have a 5% margin and a 10% tariff on top of that, you're no longer competitive. So businesses will start to fold as this continues. Finally, tertiary impact, it takes a little longer for this to be seen, but we're already hearing about this, for example, in the lobster industry of the United States. They've not only started to lose business and become non-competitive in certain markets, they're beginning to lay people off as a result of that. When you lay people off, the economy slows, and as we know, spending power nationally will start to go down. So the national economy will start to slow down. And we're going to get into that last line about how companies must flex to survive. Later in the slideshow, I'm going to talk about how Certain companies can be flexible. Others, Richard, I'm sure would agree, agricultural products, it's very hard to be flexible. These are the key players, from my perspective, in the current trade conflict regarding especially the U.S. and the EU. If you don't know, the folks in the left slide, they are the presidents, respectively, of the Russian Federation, China, and Turkey. On the right side, we have our current president, along with the European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. And those folks recently had a meeting and staved off the U.S.-EU trade war by basically declaring an armistice while things were being discussed. We'll get into later the fact that very little has been discussed. I'm not sure how long that armistice is going to last. I will give you a date, which is as soon as the automobile manufacturers in the United States start to report their quarterly earnings in October. That is likely when this trade war will either begin again or be put on ice, depending upon how the U.S. manufacturers do. That's my perspective. Trade representatives for both the United States and the EU. On the left, we have the Swede, Cecilia Malmström, who has been in that job for many years. She's a very calm person. Robert Lighthizer also has been in this business for many years. He was an economic advisor to Senator Dole. Newer to this crowd, but a driving influence in a lot of the U.S. perspectives on trade is Peter Navarro. He is the one who is virulently anti-China. He also has a tendency to be virulently anti-German for different reasons, but that is why I think, since he's obviously had a lot of impact on how the administration is reacting to China, I think we can see him also pushing a little bit on Germany in the years or the months to come. When there is a trade conflict, the first thing that you have is confusion and hesitance. And so, for example, Volvo was all ready to do an IPO. They are owned by in large part by a Chinese company, and their immediate response to the threat of a trade war was just to stop their proposed IPO. They are not going to move forward until there's clarity in the market. That's clear for a lot of businesses. They're hesitating. They don't know what to expect. The other thing that is happening with this trade conflict is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. With Russia and China, they have become very close politically over the last few months. That is detrimental, I believe, to U.S. interests. It is frightening for me to hear bluntly stated by leaders of those two nations that they intend to work together against U.S. interests. Normally, those are the type of things that you hint at, as opposed to saying in the press, but they have said that now on multiple occasions. And finally, production, sales, all of that will start to go down, which obviously is a drag on the overall, not only U.S. economy, but global economy. When that happens, we will face unemployment in the United States. Right now, we're at historically low levels of unemployment in the United States and in several other countries that have been enjoying this resurgent economy. That will change very quickly if this goes on for an extended period of time. Why I believe the word trade war is not a misnomer is because it has been proven time and time again that trade wars do in fact lead to war. This goes back to our 1920s, 1930s. I did not bother to title Smoot and Hawley because I'm sure they are known to many of you. But the one on the left, Senator Fordney from the Fordney-McCumber Tariff Act, he may be less well known. Both of those acts gave the United States tremendously high tariff levels for product coming in from other parts of the world. That was great, led to the Roaring '20s, as has been pointed out, but it made it very hard for other countries to import into the United States at the same time that we were expecting them to pay their war debt from World War I. So the reparations number that you see there, that is how Germany felt, and I'm by no means excusing anyone for their choices as a nation leading to World War II. But clearly, it was an influencing factor that led to World War II, the economic situation that we essentially imposed on the world. Everyone got in on this. French tariffs for automobiles went up to 100% as a result of our actions. Action, reaction, right? Everyone got involved in the trade war, and next thing you know, we had a real war on our hands. Now, you may think that I am overstating my case, but I will let someone else make it for me. I'll let you read this because I'm not sure I can pronounce all the terminology used in this. But this was a very academic synopsis of a research study that was done at Stanford. It sounds like it's very old, but it's actually only 1980, which for me isn't that old, right? The bottom line is the one that, especially if you can't read it, is most relevant. It says, or second to the bottom, a doubling of trade on average leads to 20% reduction in conflict. I'm paraphrasing that. But the fact of the matter is, more trade means less war. World Bank agrees. They've seen this as a major problem in Africa, especially, where they are very concerned about ongoing conflicts in that continent, and they believe that one of the best ways to solve them is through trade. Stanford Business made it a little clearer back in 2017. They gave us a much easier to digest question, which is, can trade prevent war? The answer is yes. This is not just coming from the United States, though. This is something that was published very recently in a Chinese newspaper, the South China Morning Post, which, as I understand, is in fact out of Hong Kong. They see this too. They know that this trade war is perhaps more than just a trade war. This is part of a broader conflict between the United States and China that is leading us into, I don't want to say uncharted territory, but I would say dangerous territory. Now, from a pure business perspective, unless you are a war profiteer, major world conflict is very bad. The Europeans recognize this. And that's why after World War II, which decimated obviously their continent, they said no more. And Robert Schuman, who was born in Luxembourg but ended up becoming the French foreign minister, he declared that the whole reason behind starting the European Union was that they wanted to make sure the war was not only unthinkable but materially impossible by tying the countries together so much that they would be unable to go to war with each other. I believe it's been very successful in that regard. Europe has been in peace for the most part, at least those countries in the EU, for the longest period of time in modern history. They're also very good NATO allies for us in the United States. Speaking of Europe, this allows us to segue into their perspective. We'll start with the EU, because the EU as a block of countries, even though it's 28, moving on to 27 individual nations, they have all given their authority to negotiate trade to the EU. They have opinions, they have desires, but at the end of the day, it's the European Union that will be negotiating on their behalf with the United States. And the EU perspective is the US administration has become an enigma. They do not know what to expect out of us. And much like business, it makes it hard to decide where to go forward because they do not know what sort of reaction they will get out of the administration. As all of you know, and I don't mean this as a critique, it's just a fact, US policy seems to come out of Twitter accounts early in the morning. It's not necessarily vetted through all of the parties. It is not coming as a direct press release from the White House or from the Department of State. It has become chaotic at times. That makes it very hard for the European Union to set an agenda and a strategy with the United States because they don't know what's going to come next. I think they're also surprised that we're not using the World Trade Organization. It is there for this reason. Trade issues are to be brought to the WTO. Yes, we have special 301 powers and things of that nature that allow the president for security reasons to assess tariffs, but we're supposed to be using the WTO. And we have used the WTO very successfully. The United States, even though it's a long and arduous process and nobody really likes to go through it because it takes years, the fact of the matter is we win more than we lose. And so the Europeans, who are very much a rule of law society, especially in Brussels, they're like, why aren't you using that as opposed to using these unilateral tariffs? I believe they're angry in the sense that they have had a much less successful recovery from the 2008 recession than we have had. They have been trying their best. They didn't have quite the quantitative easing that we did at the beginning of this process. So growth rates in the EU have just started to climb over the last year and a half, 2 years, and now we drop this on the table. I think they're frustrated that when they're having their Brexit issues and other world conflicts that they're trying to stamp out, like the refugee issue that they had a couple of years ago, we're sticking a finger in their economic eye, which is not something that they're particularly happy about. On the other hand, they're very mature, they're agile, they're going to take advantage of this to the extent that they can. If the U.S. is going to wall off Chinese products and make it harder for Chinese companies to do business in the United States, they will be very happy to take that business. The United Kingdom is in a slightly different position. They are in the midst of extricating themselves from the EU. I think, when did I have the Brexit discussion here? 2 years ago. We're still talking about this. Yes, sir. Europe, from a geopolitical perspective, is concerned with the apparent use of currency manipulation by China. They are very concerned about environmental issues vis-a-vis China as far as greenhouse gas emissions. They are less concerned, because of where they are, about the South China Sea issue and all of those things, which are more of a concern in the United States because we're on the Pacific. But when it comes to trade, they have never, at least as I know, they have not threatened any tariffs against China as an attempt to resolve these concerns. That is where we diverge from Europe here in the United States, because they would take those issues to diplomatic channels. They would take those issues to the WTO for resolution. Our decision to impose unilateral tariffs is very different from where they would go with this, and that is why they are going to complain about it, because they know it's going to throw a wrench into their own recovery. But they're also going to be prepared if the U.S. walls off Fortress America from an economic perspective. These European companies, who are main competitors in many things, they will be able to sell their product at a lower rate than they have been previously. And they will eat up as much of that red ocean space as they can. Because the businesses and the governments, they're all aiming for prosperity, but the businesses are much more concerned about business issues. The governments are very concerned about potential for conflict, but the businesses have to operate with what's in front of them. And what's in front of them is going to be less competition. So they are going to eat up that space to the extent that they can. It's not that they aren't supporting us from a geostrategic perspective, but on one hand, the United States is saying tariffs against China. On the other hand, they're saying tariffs against European Union. So they are not in lockstep with us by any means in this issue. And yet, on the other hand, they, from a press release, public perspective, world leaders making statements angle, they have been very much against this, very much against what they consider to be a unilateral trade war against China. Not that they aren't unhappy with how certain things are done in current practice by the Chinese government. They have state-owned enterprises. That's not a concept that the Europeans are really fans of, although they're more fans of it than we are. They don't agree with how we're dealing with this. And they're not going to back us up. If it comes to trade war with China, they're not going to join in on it, because they are in the same position as we are, which is that they use those products. They have very close diplomatic discussions, if not relations, with the Chinese, and they will always leave that door open that we appear to be closing. It's just the nature of the European Union as a body. Yes?
Yeah.
Just to paraphrase what she said, the current trade situation in Europe is the same as it is in the United States, which is that Chinese products are preferenced to a certain extent because they have lower tariff levels coming into Europe, as they do in the United States, than we do going there, as do European products going there. The problem is that they are unhappy about that, but they are also using the WTO as the forum for addressing these problems. That is how they feel they should be resolved. China was allowed to join the World Trade Organization specifically so that we could drag them in to the rule of law process.
As a third world country.
Well, now they're a WTO member, and this is how we deal with it. Now, the other issue, consumers are driving this to a certain extent. People want to pay less for their t-shirts and their pans, and they do in the United States. In Europe, they don't necessarily, because of the taxes that are put on top of these products. It's amazing to buy the same t-shirt in Czech Republic, you end up paying $12 that you can get it for $3 in the United States. But that's because of the taxes that the EU has added to that product that is coming out of China to both continents. In any event, you're absolutely right. The Europeans are not happy with the way certain aspects of Chinese trade goes, but they don't believe that a trade war is going to resolve the issue, especially because in the end, and if it's lingering, it will be detrimental to their growth. And right now they need growth more than they need anything. Back to the United Kingdom. Once they leave the EU, their requirement is to start fresh with trade negotiations, because they will have none. All of the agreements that have been negotiated on behalf of the United Kingdom by the EU will no longer be valid. So they are going to be starting fresh. And in fact, they're already in discussions with the U.S. Government about a U.S.-UK trade agreement. But I think they're a little scared as to what awaits them when those actually take place, because we have been very hard bargainers as far as our U.S. trade representative. If you look at the recent renegotiations of NAFTA, Mexico probably didn't get a great deal out of that. This is why Canada, I think, is hesitating to finalize that agreement, is they're not happy with it. So if the UK thinks that they're suddenly going to have a wonderful open trade relationship with the United States, they're probably deluding themselves. I think that they will be lucky to get a moderate deal, which is close enough to what they have now. But we'll see, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Brexit, again, the United Kingdom, those of you who watch currencies, you saw what happened to the pound when Brexit was released. It got kicked around a few more times. It's quite weak. Their growth has been anemic and going down based upon Brexit, and it's going to be even worse if there is a global trade war, because these weaker economies will be the first ones to suffer. Still, in the interest of being agile, if there's business to be had, they will do what they can to take it. So if there is a gap between the EU and the US and China, they're going to need to work that space to keep their economy going in the right direction. So that's why this gentleman up there, Crawford Falconer, who has been appointed as the trade representative and negotiator, is prepared to do whatever needs to be done to make sure that the United Kingdom has some good agreements moving forward. Future of US-EU trade negotiations, they did make a public statement recently, and they said that we will meet in November. It was a very bland statement. They said specifically, we hope for an early harvest in the area of technical barriers to trade. Those of you who know trade know that technical barriers are things such as labeling, safety measures, and then it gets into these legitimate trade barriers, which are those that protect human health and the environment. There is no stronger proponent for high-level barriers based on environmental and human health issues than the European Union. They are number one in that regard. They will fight tooth and nail to protect their population, which is laudable, but it means that if anyone thinks that they're going to get an easy harvest of less technical barriers in that area, I think they're mistaken. The one question I have about that is the fact that Monsanto, which, as many of you know, was enemy number one for genetically modified agricultural products, well, they were bought out by Bayer, which is a German company. So there's a part of me that wonders, first of all, the EU had to approve that from a competition perspective, but they also had to approve the mere fact that a German company was buying what many people in the Green parties, for example, consider to be enemy number one. Does that indicate a shift in direction? From what I've heard, the answer is no. But I think it's worth keeping an eye on that, because maybe I'll be surprised, and in fact, the EU will shift gear a little bit on GMOs, which would be a big win for the United States if it ever happens, although it would be an even bigger win apparently for Bayer, since they now own most of it. I was in the Czech Republic and was involved in the Doha round negotiations. Like I said, at that point, the individual nations of the European Union do not actually make trade deals, but they obviously influence the process. So we were lobbying the Czech government on Doha round stuff for 2 years. I don't want to say it was a complete waste of time, because we had some great negotiations, we made some progress, but the talks ultimately failed. 5 years of discussions, Doha round, did not succeed. I think that this is an important teaching point for the current administration as they look to move the EU-US trade agreement forward. It will be slow. It will take time. And we don't seem to be very good at things that have a long time horizon in the United States, partially because of our own election cycle. But the other thing that the US has always been hammering on the EU about is the financial services industry. And that's going to be very interesting, because right now with Brexit, everyone who's in Europe wants to take London's financial services industry and move it down to their country. Frankfurt, Paris, Luxembourg, they're all aiming to get a piece of London's pie. The idea that they would then turn around and open up that access to the United States, to me, is a bit of a pipe dream, because that will be one of the last things that they would be willing to open up, in my opinion. And I think that this picture proves me right. Because if you look closely, you can see that the EU Trade Commissioner is actually attempting to choke the US representative across the room. So this is just indicative of the direction that negotiations will go in the months to come. But keep an eye out for November and see what comes out of the discussions. All right, this is a little text heavy, so I'll let you read it for a bit. The first point I already mentioned to a certain extent. Any of you dealing with chemical importation exports? REACH has been an issue. Meat products, we've got traces. They've got an acronym for just about any product you might think of. The fact of the matter is, what we need to be aware of is that those health and safety concerns were tempered, actually, by the United Kingdom. And with them out of the EU, I believe that you will see even higher levels of concern for health and safety. Things like REACH will become the norm. They will probably be more than happy to regulate some of these unfavorable chemicals or products out of existence in their market. Problem is we haven't done that in the United States, and we want to be able to sell them into Europe. This is why we have these NTBs. I don't see that getting any easier once the UK leaves, because as a former sick man of Europe that had very low environmental standards, they're probably going to retreat a bit once they're out of the EU in an attempt to get some of that market space. But the EU, on the other hand, will go the other direction. So we'll see. I do think that whatever deal you get from the UK and the EU, keep an eye on that Brexit deal, which theoretically may come already in November, because I think it will show what they're willing to give to the United States. And if it's a very bad deal for the United Kingdom, then I should expect that we will also be facing an uphill climb. If there's room to maneuver and backroom deals made at the last moment, that may be a good indication that we actually have some positive perspectives in our future negotiations with the EU, which again, may not come, right? This trade war could remain on ice forever. It was the US who decided that they were going to take the EU into this conflict by assessing tariffs on automobiles. That's where this all started, right? All right, shifting gears. Russia, geographically, much of Russia, including its capital, are in Europe. It is a European culture, country. People don't automatically think about Russia when they think about Europe, but I think they need to. And the Russian perspective is very different, because Russia isn't playing by our Western rules. Russia is involved in the WTO, the UN, obviously, but their perspectives are very different than ours. They look at war, this is a Clausewitz quotation for any of you who know the great German military strategist. His original quote was, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." In other words, you have politics, and war is just part of that spectrum. A trade war is also part of that spectrum, and the Russians are comfortable with the fact that there is about to be a trade war between the United States and China, because it has led them into the arms of the Chinese. They are having a wonderful time together over the last couple of months. They had the largest military exercise in the last 40 years in Russia over in the east, and for the first time ever, China participated in this. This is a very disturbing issue from the U.S. security perspective, because when those two are operating together right in the area of Korea and Japan, of course, we have security obligations in that area, which things would go wrong very quickly if something happened where Russia and China decided to work against our interests there. Russia's top trading partner is China. We're the bottom line here. So our sanctions, this is really before sanctions started, this trade statistics from 2013, were not really important to them. So even though we have been assessing sanctions and threatening them with trade war, not a big problem for them. Their largest trading partner is China, and they will just get more from China if China can't export in the United States. Russia will gladly take it. China, on the other hand, has the inverse problem. The United States, largest trading partner. Russia's down here somewhere around 10. So Russia's perspective on this is very different than ours. And nevertheless, the United States administration currently seems to be ready to fight on all fronts. China, Russia, European Union, and another country we'll get to in a second. The other thing I just wanted to remind people, anyone familiar with this company? It's a Russian company. It's a defense company. It's the largest defense company in Russia. And if you have any questions that they do things differently than we do, then I will just tell you that this is a state-owned enterprise, that the guy who's the CEO of this is a former KGB agent who was Putin's roommate in Dresden when they were both working during the Cold War in Germany. This is how stuff works in Russia. And this trade war and our rule of law and our WTO aspirations, they will play that game, but they are operating under very different rules. Their only interest is the oligarchs and the head guy getting paid and keeping everyone else quiet through the Roman term, bread in circuses, right? It is not a participatory democracy like we have in the United States and Europe. All right, Turkey is a fascinating, wonderful country. I've been there many times. I love the people. I'm, along with many other people, including Richard Paulin sitting here, very disappointed with the current leadership of Turkey. It has become, unfortunately, a kleptocracy. The gentleman there on the right side is someone that initially got along quite well with President Trump. That has changed. The stated issue is a U.S. pastor that is being held in jail in Turkey that they refuse to release. I don't believe that that is really the issue. That certainly is one of them. But the fact of the matter is that Turkey and the U.S. have been having conflict for many years over their role in the region. We have been their number one advocate to get into the European Union. For 20 years, we were knocking on doors in the EU to have them be part of the European Union. Ultimately, we failed, although that process in theory is still ongoing. Ultimately, we failed, though, because Turkey took their country in a different direction. They gave up on human rights. They gave up on freedom of the press. The president has manipulated his constitution so that he can essentially stay in power for the rest of his life. Last week, he appointed himself as the head of the sovereign wealth fund for the country. And just to make things more interesting, he appointed his son-in-law as the deputy. I'm sure there's a lot of good dialogue between the two of them, but it's not a country, unfortunately, like the United States, like the European Union, where you have rule of law, transparency. That's gone out the window, and that may be one of the reasons why the lira is tanking, because investors know that that country is headed for some sort of major problem. And one of their issues, of course, is that they are sitting on a refugee population, currently the largest refugee population in the world, of 3.5 million Syrian refugees. Now, I don't know how many of you remember what happened when Turkey last opened the gates to Europe. You had millions of people flowing into the European Union. European Union didn't really have a good plan for how to deal with these people, and many of them, ended up in Germany, paperless, jobless. Many of them were single males who came there and then tried to invite their families to join them later. We lived in Germany for the last 9 years. My wife worked specifically with this population of people, and out of all the people that came into Germany, only 12% of them are currently involved in the labor market. The rest of them are non-participatory, either because they don't want to, or they can't get the paperwork, or the host nation doesn't know what to do with them. If this were to happen again, if those 3.5 million people that are currently sitting in Turkey are released to flood the European Union again, you're going to have chaos, and you're going to have an economic nightmare. And my feeling is that President Erdogan is well aware of this, but if his economy is going off the rails, he's going to release these people into the European Union because he has no reason to keep them in Turkey anymore. The Turkish population is sick of them. They are having conflicts in all of the urban areas with those folks because they're not Turkish. They don't speak Turkish languages. They speak Arabic. And he's only keeping them because the European Union has been paying billions of dollars to Turkey to keep that population in Turkey. So, again, global war on a trade level, which brings down the economy, is going to start having some very fascinating ripple effects. And I think this is one of the major flashpoints that I'm not seeing a lot of people talk about it, but he's thinking about it. Trump threatened to double down on the trade war with Turkey. His response is, they've got their dollars, but we've got God. I don't know what that means for him, because apparently that means he doesn't have dollars. But what it does mean is that he is now using language that makes me uncomfortable and makes me think that he's willing to use all sorts of propaganda. and his refugee population to solve his fiscal issues. So keep an eye on that. All right, deep breath. There are a lot of concerns in that part of the world, and they sometimes keep me up at night, but I can't really do much about it. What I can do is hopefully tell some of the companies that are out there how they can avoid these time bombs or traps. And flexibility is the key. And not all companies can be flexible because of the product they sell, but where there is flexibility, you need to project it and you need to find solutions. And a lot of that has to do with where your product is coming in from. Rules of origin, which I'll touch on briefly. But you know, the EU, if it becomes a target of a US trade war and the tariffs go up, there are other countries, that surround it, to include Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, that have special agreements with the European Union. A savvy company can put their products together in those countries, assuming they comply with the rules of origin, and you can ship into the EU tariff-free. Not every company will be able to do that. There are probably some experts in the room who, feel free to stick your hand up, who can help companies do that if that's what they want to do. But when it becomes a cost-benefit analysis, cheaper to move your product into Ukraine and then assemble it and have it introduced into Europe as a Ukrainian product, by all means do it. People need to project these potential solutions in order to resolve, you know, if you're just looking at a tariff wall that is too high to get over, go around it. That's why there are two other trade agreements that are extremely important for us to consider. The Japan-EU trade agreement, which was signed very recently, is supposed to be the largest bilateral trade deal ever. They've reduced tariffs to almost nothing between Japan and the EU. That's huge business. And if you can get in on that by moving your product through a Japanese subsidiary, by all means, you've got a great open space to play with. Canada also signed the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, the CETA. That was also a very big agreement, and one that I think U.S. companies, if they have that flexibility, can take advantage of. Yes, question. The question was, did Japan and the EU reduce tariffs on automobiles also? The answer is yes. I'm not sure to what level. They did reduce it. Again, the non-tariff barriers are of interest here because with cars and specifications for emissions, you can use that as another wall that has nothing to do with the actual tariff rate. But there are, supposedly they lowered almost everything to zero. Again, I'm not a Japan expert. Maybe we have someone in the room who can, yes, please. The question was how tariffs interact with the foreign trade zones and the free trade zones that we have around the world. They're all different. For example, you know, the ones that we have here in this area, I'm only vaguely familiar with how they work, and I wouldn't want to speak to that. Tariffs essentially just raise your pricing when you're selling the product locally. So if you bring something in a foreign trade area that you're moving on elsewhere, the tariff won't impact it, should not impact it, because it's outside of the market. It's only when it enters the market that you would pay. So in that sense, it shouldn't impact those. On the other hand, there are different definitions of that term, and for example, in Ireland, I don't know if we have anybody here from the IDA, but they have a different process, and a lot of their stuff is in transit to the EU, so it's sort of a misnomer to call a free trade area because it's really just a staging ground. Those would still be paying. So in good legalese, the answer is it depends. So, yes, more questions. Excellent point. I don't know if all of you heard him, but he said if you're bringing raw products in and then sending a produced product out as a U.S. then, and also the EU-Mexico agreement, which is a little older, but still relevant, obviously, for this. Although, the Financial Times this morning, you know, the Apple product, it wasn't listed on there as one that would be subject to tariff. And there's a reason for that, which is that if you start to push those very strong, very powerful industries, you may get a different result than you intended. You know, Kentucky whiskey, Kentucky bourbon, excuse me, they don't have a lot of ways to fight back against a tariff, because they can't move their manufacturing out of Kentucky. But a lot of these other companies have agility, and that's why they're not necessarily the first place to go after, because you're not getting the political result that you want. You know? All right, rules of origin. A lot of probably smarter people out there on rules of origin. I know we have some attorneys here who probably touch on these issues. The WTO doesn't actually set them. They're set individually by the markets. And the EU, for example, has their own set of rules as to what the rules of origin are for products. CETA, the new Canadian agreement, has a web link, which I think I put here in the next slide for those of you who get the presentation, where it goes in great detail through the rules of origin and how your product would qualify as Canadian or not, depending upon those rules. But this is an issue for consideration when you are thinking of moving your production, which is a great solution when you can do it. There may be some political ramifications of doing that, as poor Harley Davidson found out. As a Wisconsin native, you know, I'm always happy to see Harley Davidson be successful, which hasn't happened for like a decade. And this was just bad news for them when they were told that they wanted to move their production overseas because of some of the concerns of the trade war. They got a direct response from the president, which is not anything you normally want as a business, criticizing them for their choice. But the fact of the matter is, they're not the only ones who are moving overseas. Polaris, anyone that was on that list of products that are about to be nailed with tariffs, you have to start looking at moving your production if it's a viable option. Mark and I talked about this yesterday. Not always a viable option. You may not be able to source things cheaper. That 10% may not make a difference, enough of a difference for you, but where you can, you should. And here's a country that would welcome you. He's made it very clear, he welcomes everyone. And the fact of the matter is, Canada and Mexico, but Canada for the Midwest, I mean, it's literally right around the corner. And if you can move your manufacturing, maybe this is not patriotic of me, but if you can move your manufacturing to Canada to avoid potential trade conflicts, I think as a business person, you have to at least consider it, do the cost-benefit analysis. The other thing, of course, is establishing a company in Europe. It's not that hard. Establishing a company, there's a lot of other things that are hard about it, like finding the right place to go, finding the right people to work there for you. But the first line there, the EU created this wonderful mechanism called the SE, the Sociétés Européennes, which is basically a corporation that can move its seat to any of the member nations. So if you're sitting in Netherlands with an SE and you decide, I really want to move all my operations to Lithuania, you just pick up a corporation and move. So even though they're different countries, they've now got a very mobile corporation process. Or you can go through the traditional routes. You can have your GmbH, you can have your French or Czech corporation, and that just means that you're going to be there. But they're very easy to set up. And this link right here shows you how to set up in every country of the EU. Just go to that link. It will tell you where to go, get the instructions on how to set up your company. Lithuania, you just go to Invest Lithuania, which, by the way, they're wonderful people. I met with them. They have a great product to sell. If you don't mind seasonal affective disorder, because it's very dark all year. Same's true for Norway, where I lived for 3 years. It's a great country, although it's tremendously expensive, but it's not expensive to set up a corporation, right? It's a very easy process. In fact, I guess I keep talking about the north. It's probably where I spend most of my time. Estonia, if you look at the bottom left of this slide, you can set up a company in 3 hours. It's amazing. And you can do it all online. So if you are really looking for ways to increase the flexibility of your company and set up a small research and development and production facility in these countries, you can do it quickly, painlessly, and we're more than happy to help you. All right. This is where I look at Richard again, who's worked with agricultural products a lot. If you sell agricultural products or raw materials, you're going to have to call Congress. I mean, I thought about this, I talked to a lot of people, but if you have a product that you cannot modify or produce in a different country, you have to make noise, because much like the lobsters are in the New England, U.S. waters. You cannot move your lobster production facility. You cannot move your soybeans. That means that unless you're going to process it at some point, you are stuck with whatever tariffs are being assessed on the United States by whatever country we're talking about. That doesn't mean that you sit there and bemoan your losses and go out of business. Hopefully it means that you're a very active participant in our democratic process, and you're calling your congresspeople and your representatives and most importantly the newspapers to tell them your stories, because that's the only way that our political leaders will hear about the pain that is being faced in the U.S. economy, is if people tell them that there's pain. Nobody reads your quarterly reports unless they're an investor, right? You have to take your story to the press and to your congressperson. All right, and if you're looking to stay informed on these issues, I of course will plug the Samson Atlantic Twitter feed, because especially in these interesting times, I'm posting a lot of what I consider to be relevant trade analysis, op-ed pieces. I mean, you all read the newspaper, so you know there are new tariffs, but I try to look for the more interesting second-level stuff that may be coming from Europe. The U.S. Trade Representative website, if you click on that link, you get to their press releases. Those are usually chock full of information. There just haven't been many of them. If you look at their press release page, there's one every 2 to 3 weeks, which is not what one would expect with all the ongoing excitement. EU Trade site has the same. Department of Commerce, and I know the Department of Commerce person was supposed to join us here, but they are a great source of information, much of it free for people who have questions about business operations overseas. And then finally, for those of you who want to get a more EU-specific view of the news, I can highly recommend those last four as being different. You're not going to get the same stuff you would in the Chicago Tribune, but they give you great insights as to how the European bureaucratic process is looking at these issues. Questions? Yes, Zach.
Do you think people are just waiting this whole thing out?
You're absolutely correct. The question was, are people waiting this out? I think many of them are. And I think they're foolish to do so, because if you look at what the former CEO of Alibaba, Jack Ma, a very interesting, very intelligent man, former educator, wonderful English speaker, what did he say yesterday? He expects this to take 20 years. He wouldn't be surprised if it takes 20 years for the U.S.-China trade spat to resolve itself. I'm not quite that far on the scale. But I know, again, looking at the Doha round negotiations, to get a negotiated agreement from any of these major players is going to take years. It's going to take years. And any educated, respected commentator that I have read over the last couple of weeks has essentially agreed with that as being a major point of miscommunication between our administration and the people we're talking at, which is that our administration seems to think that they can do something quickly, but no one on the other side is at all willing to do that. And they're going to go through a lot of pain before someone finally realizes, hey, this is a long-term issue, and then it's kind of hard to back out of it. But no, I think the people that just wait it out are also the ones who usually you see in bankruptcy court a couple years down the road. You have to maintain flexibility and agility. You have to find solutions now as opposed to waiting it out, because if you wait it out and you suddenly find that your product is not profitable, others will have moved more quickly and be positioned to take that space, wherever they come from. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think people are waiting it out. And that's unfortunate, because that usually doesn't end well. Yes, sir. Your point was that anti-dumping laws and the process for addressing them are very much still valid. And I would point to the WTO thing that we mentioned earlier. These mechanisms exist and will continue to exist regardless of what happens on the trade war level. And that companies, savvy companies, will continue to work all angles of the issue. They will be cognizant of their anti-dumping concerns. They will be looking to see what sort of new regulation is coming out of Europe or whatever market they go into. They'll be looking for other production facilities to avoid potential tariffs. It's a full-time job, and I know a lot of you folks are doing it for your companies, and it's a lot of work, but it's the so-called volatile and unknown environment that really good companies will thrive in, and those who aren't so good will not thrive in. And we're just hoping that today helped you to thrive a little bit more, as the ITAGC does every time they have an event. They make you smarter and better and well-fed. So thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.